If I had known the truth about that night, I would have never stood in front of him and asked that question. Rain fell in thin sheets over the hospital parking garage, turning the asphalt into a blur of silver reflections as Emma Carter gripped the edge of her coat, her voice trembling but unbroken as she looked up at the man she once thought she understood and said, "Tell me the truth about that night." William Hayes stood still beneath the dim overhead light, his expensive coat darkened by the rain, his expression unreadable as if he had been expecting this moment longer than she could ever imagine. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, almost tired. "You're not ready to hear it." Emma let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head as if she could physically push away the confusion tightening in her chest, because for years she had carried only one version of him in her memory, the version that disappeared without explanation, the version she believed abandoned her when she needed him most, the version that left her raising a child alone, while she repeated to herself that he simply did not care. And now, standing here in the cold night air with the distant sound of cars passing on the main road, that belief felt both fragile and dangerously incomplete. William took a slow step closer, but not enough to close the distance between them, as if he knew that any movement forward might break something already strained beyond repair, and his eyes flickered briefly toward the hospital entrance before returning to her face. "You said I didn't care," he repeated softly, as though testing the weight of her words after all these years, and Emma tightened her grip on her own arms, forcing herself not to look away. "Because you didn't," she said, each word sharpened by memory, by exhaustion, by years of unanswered questions. "You were there once, and then you were gone." At that, something shifted in his expression, not anger, not defense, but something quieter, heavier, like a door in his past being pushed open whether he wanted it or not. For a brief moment, Emma's mind flickered with an image she couldn't fully grasp, a fragment of a different night, softer lights, a distant sound of rain, a voice she couldn't quite place telling her to stay calm. But every time she tried to hold on to it, it slipped away like water through her fingers. William exhaled slowly, glancing down as if choosing each word carried consequences far beyond this moment. "That night wasn't what you think it was." Emma's voice rose slightly, cracking under the pressure of everything she had buried for years. "Then explain it to me. Because all I remember is waking up alone." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the hum of the city and the distant echo of doors opening at the hospital entrance, and when William finally spoke again, his voice carried something she had never heard from him before, not authority, not distance, but restraint shaped by something deeply personal. "I didn't leave because I stopped caring. I left because staying would have put you in the middle of something you were never meant to be part of." Emma stared at him, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and fear of understanding, because the way he said it did not sound like an excuse, it sounded like a boundary he had been forced to accept, and for the first time she noticed the faint tension in his hands, the way he kept them still as if even the smallest movement might reveal too much. "You expect me to believe that?" she whispered, but her certainty was already beginning to fracture. William met her gaze directly now, his voice quieter but sharper in meaning. "I don't expect anything from you. I just need you to understand that what you think you know about that night is only part of it." The rain began to fall harder, tracing lines down the concrete between them, and Emma felt something unfamiliar rising beneath her anger, not forgiveness, not trust, but uncertainty, the kind that reshapes everything it touches, because somewhere in the back of her mind, a question she had buried for years was finally starting to surface. If he truly didn't care, why did it feel like he had been carrying that night alone all along? The silence between them did not break, it deepened, as if the night itself was waiting for one of them to admit something neither had ever spoken aloud, and Emma Carter finally looked away first, not because she had lost confidence, but because holding his gaze felt like standing too close to a truth she was not prepared to face. Rainwater dripped from the edge of the concrete above them, marking slow, irregular beats that echoed the tension in her chest. William Hayes remained still, his presence calm on the surface, but there was a subtle weight in the way he breathed, controlled yet measured, as if every second spent here was calculated against something larger than both of them. Emma exhaled sharply and stepped back just enough to create space, her voice lower now but steadier. You keep saying I do not understand, but you never stayed long enough for me to understand anything. William did not respond immediately. Instead, his eyes shifted briefly toward the distant glow of hospital windows where warm light contrasted sharply with the cold parking garage, and when he spoke again, his tone carried a restrained honesty that seemed unfamiliar even to him. I stayed longer than you think. Emma frowned slightly, her frustration breaking through again. That is not true. After that night, you disappeared. No calls. No explanation. Nothing. A faint tension crossed his jaw, not anger, but something closer to reluctance, as if each word she spoke forced him further into territory he had avoided for years, and when he finally answered, his voice was quieter, almost reluctant. I did not disappear. I was removed. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and confusing, and Emma felt an immediate resistance rise inside her, because that explanation did not match the narrative she had built her entire life around, the one where she was simply abandoned without reason. Removed by who? She asked, her voice tightening, but William did not answer right away. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and paused, as if reconsidering whether to reveal something he had carried for far too long, and when he finally pulled out a folded piece of paper, it looked worn, handled many times but never fully opened in front of anyone else. Emma hesitated as he extended it toward her, her fingers uncertain as they took it, and when she unfolded it under the dim light, she saw what appeared to be a confidential notice, names partially redacted, references to a security investigation, and at the bottom a timestamp matching the same night she had tried to remember for years. Her heart slowed slightly, confusion replacing anger in waves, because nothing about this document matched the simple version of events she had believed. What is this? She whispered, her voice barely audible. William's gaze stayed fixed on her, not on the paper, as if he was watching her reaction more than revisiting his own memory, and he answered carefully. That night, I was already being monitored. Anything personal, anything that connected me to someone outside the company, it would have put them in danger. Emma shook her head slightly, struggling to process the implication. You are saying I was in danger? William's expression tightened just slightly, not dramatic, but enough to show the weight behind his restraint. I am saying I made a choice so that you were not. For a moment, Emma did not respond, her mind pulling between disbelief and the uncomfortable possibility that the absence she had interpreted as indifference might have been something else entirely, something hidden, something controlled, something she was never meant to see. The sound of a distant ambulance echoed faintly through the night, reminding her of where they were standing, of the hospital just behind them, of the life she had built in the aftermath of unanswered silence. If that is true, she said slowly, her voice softer now, then why did it feel like I was the only one who lost everything? William lowered his eyes briefly, and when he spoke again, there was no corporate certainty left in his voice, only something human and unpolished. Because I let you believe I was gone. And that is the part one cannot fix. Emma's grip tightened around the folded paper, not out of anger now, but because her hands no longer knew what to hold on to, and for the first time since she had seen him again, the question she had carried for years no longer had a simple answer, only a widening space where certainty used to be. Emma Carter stood frozen under the dim glow of the parking garage light, the folded document still trembling slightly in her hand as if it carried more weight than paper alone, and for a long moment neither she nor William Hayes spoke, because something between them had shifted in a way that could not be reversed once acknowledged. The air felt colder now, or perhaps it was only her awareness of how close she had been to a truth she never imagined existed. Finally, she looked up again, her voice quieter but sharper with controlled emotion. If you were being monitored, if all of this was real, then why did you never find me afterward? William's gaze did not immediately meet hers, and when it did, it carried a depth of exhaustion that suggested this question had followed him for years without rest. Because finding you would have made it worse, he said carefully, as if each word had already been measured against consequences she could not yet see. Emma shook her head slightly, disbelief mixing with frustration. Worse for who? I spent years believing you simply chose to walk away. I raised a child thinking you did not care if we survived or not." At the mention of her son, something subtle tightened in William's expression, not surprise, but recognition layered with restraint, and he lowered his voice slightly. "I know what you believed. And I never corrected it because correcting it would have led them straight to you." The words landed heavily between them, and Emma felt her certainty begin to fracture again, not because she trusted him, but because the explanation was too precise to dismiss immediately. A distant door from the hospital opened behind them, spilling a brief wave of warm light into the cold garage before closing again, leaving them in isolation once more. Emma slowly folded the document back into her hands, her fingers pressing against the creases as if trying to stabilize her thoughts. "You are asking me to believe that silence was protection?" William nodded once, a restrained gesture that carried no satisfaction, only consequence. "I am telling you that communication would have been a risk I could not take." Emma let out a slow breath. Glancing away toward the parked cars, her mind struggling to reconcile memory with the fragments now in front of her, because nothing about her past pain had ever felt like protection, only absence. "Then why show up now?" she asked, her voice barely steady. "After all this time, why appear again if disappearing was supposed to keep us safe?" William hesitated, and for the first time since they had met in this second confrontation, something in his composure slipped just slightly, revealing uncertainty beneath control. "Because the reason I stayed away no longer exists in the same way it did before," he answered, then paused as if choosing not to say more than necessary. Emma studied him carefully, noticing not only what he said, but what he refused to say, the spaces between words that suggested layers still buried beneath official explanations. "That is not an answer," she said softly, though her anger had begun to give way to something more complicated, something like confusion mixed with reluctant curiosity. William stepped back slightly, creating distance again as if instinctively returning to control, and his voice regained a careful calm. "It is all I can give you right now without putting you back in the same position you were in before." Emma tightened her grip on the paper again, her thoughts circling the same unanswered point, because every explanation he offered led to another locked door she could not yet open. "You keep talking about protection," she said slowly, "but you never asked me if I wanted to be protected from the truth." For the first time, William did not respond immediately, and in that silence something unspoken passed between them, not resolution, but recognition that the past was not a simple absence, but a structure built on decisions she had never been allowed to see. When he finally spoke, his tone was quieter, almost restrained beyond comfort. "If I had asked, you would have said no?" Emma did not deny it, because somewhere deep inside she knew he might be right, and that realization unsettled her more than anger ever had. The night around them seemed to stretch longer, the hospital light behind them flickering faintly as if marking time they could not recover, and Emma found herself standing at the edge of a truth that was no longer about abandonment, but about whether protection that required silence could ever be called love at all. The silence after his last words did not disappear, it settled deeper between them, becoming something heavier than sound, as Emma Carter stood there staring at William Hayes with the uneasy feeling that every answer he gave only opened another question he was not fully ready to explain. The folded document in her hands no longer felt like proof, but like a fragment of a story she had been kept outside of for far too long. Emma finally broke the silence, her voice quieter now, stripped of the sharpness it carried before. "If everything you are saying is true, then why does it still feel like I was discarded?" William's expression tightened slightly, not in anger, but in restraint, as if the word discarded itself carried a meaning he refused to accept. "Because what you experienced and what actually happened were never the same thing," he replied carefully. Emma looked away for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the hospital entrance again, where warm light contrasted with the cold emptiness of the parking garage, and when she spoke again her voice carried a fragile edge. "That does not change the fact that I was alone." William nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth of her experience without challenging it, and that silence between agreement and explanation felt heavier than anything said so far. "I do not expect it to change how you feel," he said. "Only what you understand." Emma turned back toward him, her frustration returning but less sharp than before, replaced by something more uncertain. Understanding without truth is just another form of confusion. For a brief moment, William did not respond, and when he finally did, his voice lowered slightly. Then let me give you one piece at a time. He reached into his coat again, this time pulling out a second item, a small access card with a faded company emblem, and placed it carefully on the hood of a nearby car between them. Emma hesitated before looking at it, her confusion deepening. What is that supposed to prove? William's eyes remained steady. That night was not just about us. It was about what I was building, and what others were trying to take from it. Emma frowned slightly, the implication not fully clear. So you chose work over everything else? William immediately shook his head once, firm but controlled. No. I chose to remove you from something that was already being targeted. Emma studied him carefully, searching for inconsistency, but what unsettled her most was not what he said, but how consistent his restraint felt, as if he had repeated these explanations in his mind countless times before ever saying them aloud. A faint sound of distant traffic passed through the garage, and Emma suddenly became aware of how long they had been standing there, suspended between confrontation and revelation. You keep speaking like I was part of something I never agreed to be part of, she said quietly. William's gaze softened slightly, though his posture remained controlled. You were never meant to be part of it at all. That is exactly why I left. Emma's breath caught slightly, not because she believed him fully, but because the logic behind his words created a version of the past that did not align with her pain, and that contradiction left her disoriented. So what am I supposed to believe? She asked, her voice quieter now, almost tired. William looked at her for a long moment before answering. Not everything yet. Only that I did not leave because you meant nothing. The words hung between them, not resolving anything, but shifting the emotional weight slightly away from certainty and towards something more unstable, something closer to possibility. Emma lowered her gaze to the access card on the car hood, then back to him, and for the first time since this encounter began, her anger was no longer leading her thoughts. Instead, there was something else, a reluctant space opening where certainty used to live, and in that space, the question she had been avoiding began to form again, not whether he had left her, but whether everything she believed about why he left had ever been complete at all. Emma Carter stood there longer than she expected, the weight of everything William Hayes had just said pressing against her thoughts like something she could not easily set down, and for the first time since seeing him again, she was no longer certain whether anger or confusion was leading her anymore. The access card on the hood of the car caught a faint reflection from the overhead light, a small object that now felt disproportionately important in a conversation built entirely on fragments and withheld truths. Emma finally reached for it, not because she trusted him, but because ignoring it felt like refusing the only tangible piece of this unfolding story. You keep giving me pieces, she said quietly, turning the card in her hand, but nothing that connects them. William watched her carefully, his expression steady but not distant, as if he understood exactly what she meant. Because the full picture is not safe for you yet. Emma let out a slow breath, shaking her head slightly. That is exactly the kind of sentence that makes everything worse. For a brief moment, something almost like a faint acknowledgement passed across his face, not disagreement, but recognition of how inadequate words sounded when placed against years of lived absence. He stepped slightly closer, though still maintaining distance, and spoke in a lower voice. The night you keep asking about was not a single event. It was a sequence of decisions happening around you that you were never meant to see. Emma looked up sharply at that, her focus narrowing. Around me. William nodded once. Not because you were the target, but because you were near the center of something I was trying to contain. The phrasing unsettled her more than she expected, not because it added clarity, but because it introduced a structure she had never considered, that her memory might have been complete only in emotion, not in context. She glanced down again at the access card, noticing now small engraved details she had missed before, subtle markings that suggested restricted entry rather than ordinary corporate use. So this is not just about you disappearing, she said slowly, more to herself than to him. It is about everything happening around. That night. William's gaze softened slightly. Yes. The simplicity of the answer made it feel heavier, not lighter. Emma exhaled again, her frustration no longer sharp but exhausted. Then why did you let me believe I was abandoned instead of just telling me even a fraction of this? William's jaw tightened briefly, and when he answered, there was a careful restraint in his voice. Because any explanation I gave would have been traced back to you eventually. Emma frowned. You keep saying that as if I should understand what that means. He paused for a moment, as if weighing whether continuing would cross a line he had been avoiding, then finally said, It means there were people watching everything connected to me, including anyone I stayed close to. Emma felt a subtle shift in her thoughts again, not acceptance, but the uncomfortable realization that his version of events was internally consistent in a way she could not easily dismiss. A distant announcement from inside the hospital briefly echoed through the garage, reminding her that life continued beyond this suspended moment, yet neither of them moved. Emma finally spoke again, her voice quieter. If what you are saying is true, then you did not just leave me. You erased yourself from me. William did not deny it. The silence that followed felt different this time, not empty but structured, as if something unspoken had finally been acknowledged between them. He lowered his eyes briefly, then said, I made sure you could move forward without being pulled into something you did not choose. Emma studied him for a long moment, and for the first time, her expression was no longer purely defensive. It was conflicted, caught between the version of him she had carried for years and the version standing in front of her now, one that did not fit cleanly into either blame or absolution. And what about now? She asked softly. Am I still part of something I do not see? William looked at her directly, his voice steady but quieter than before. Now you are only part of the truth you are ready to learn. The words did not comfort her, but they also did not dismiss her, and that balance left her standing in a space she did not recognize, where certainty had been replaced by something far more unstable, the possibility that everything she thought she understood about loss, silence, and abandonment might only be the surface of a story that had never fully ended. The night air between Emma Carter and William Hayes felt heavier now, not because anything had changed in the environment, but because something had changed in how she was beginning to interpret it, as if every word he spoke was slowly redrawing the outline of a past she thought she had already finished grieving. Emma stood still, the access card still resting in her hand, its edges pressing lightly against her skin as a reminder that nothing about this conversation was abstract anymore. She finally broke the silence, her voice quieter than before, stripped of its earlier sharpness. If I am only part of the truth I am ready to learn, then what determines what I am allowed to know? William watched her for a moment before answering, his expression controlled but no longer distant. Time and risk. Emma let out a faint, almost disbelieving breath. That sounds like something you would say to a business partner, not to someone you once disappeared from. A flicker of something unspoken crossed his face at her words, not offense, but acknowledgement of how impossible this situation had become to simplify. I never stopped being aware of you, he said quietly, and for a moment the directness of it caught her off guard, not because it resolved anything, but because it conflicted with the version of absence she had carried for years. Emma tightened her grip on the card again, her thoughts slowing as she tried to separate emotion from explanation. Then awareness without presence does not change what I lived through. William nodded slightly, as if accepting that distinction without argument. I am not asking you to rewrite what you lived through. I am asking you to understand why it happened the way it did. Emma looked down for a moment, then back at him, her voice steady but no longer angry. You keep using words like risk and containment, but you have never told me what the actual threat was. William hesitated, and in that pause, something shifted in the atmosphere between them, as if the conversation had reached a boundary he had carefully maintained for years. When he finally spoke, his voice lowered slightly. There were people within my organization who were not acting independently. Information was being tracked through personal connections. Emma frowned, trying to process the implication. You are saying I was used as a way to get to you? William shook his head once. Not used. Exposed by proximity. The distinction did not bring clarity, but it added structure to something she had never had words for before. Emma slowly turned the access card in her hand again, noticing now the faint serial markings more carefully. And this card is part of that same system. William nodded. It is from a restricted layer of access that was never meant to be public. It connects to internal systems that were active during that time. Emma looked up at him again, her expression no longer purely skeptical, but deeply conflicted. So you kept this entire layer of truth hidden while I spent years believing I was simply forgotten. William's voice remained steady, but softer now. I kept it hidden because revealing it would not have given you answers. It would have given you exposure. Emma exhaled slowly, her gaze dropping for a moment as the weight of that idea settled in, not as acceptance, but as complication. The sound of a distant elevator arriving inside the hospital broke briefly through the silence, reminding them both that life was continuing in parallel to this suspended confrontation. Emma finally spoke again, her voice quieter than before. I do not know what part of this I am supposed to feel anymore. Anger, relief, or something in between. William's expression softened slightly, not in triumph, but in something closer to understanding. You are not supposed to decide that yet. Emma looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time, the space between them no longer felt entirely like opposition. It felt like distance shaped by time and withheld truth, not by indifference. If I step into this, she said carefully, I am not stepping back into the version of my life I had before. William met her gaze directly, his voice calm but certain. No. You are stepping into the part of it that was always there, but never visible to you. Emma held his gaze, and in that moment she understood something she did not fully accept yet, that the story she had lived was not incomplete because of absence alone, but because someone had deliberately kept certain doors closed, not to erase her, but to keep her from walking into something she was never meant to survive unprepared. Emma Carter remained standing exactly where she was, as if moving even an inch would break the fragile balance forming between what she had believed for years and what William Hayes was now revealing piece by piece. And for the first time she was no longer sure whether she was being pulled toward truth or simply deeper into a version of it she still could not fully see. The access card in her hand felt heavier now, not because of its physical weight, but because of the implication that it was not just a symbol of explanation, but an invitation into something structured, hidden, and carefully controlled. Emma finally spoke again, her voice quieter, more measured. If everything you are saying is real, then why me? Why involve me at all in something that complicated? William did not answer immediately, and when he did, his tone was steady but restrained. Because you were never meant to be involved. You were only meant to exist near it, not inside it. Emma frowned slightly, her frustration returning but no longer explosive, more like a slow pressure building beneath understanding. That does not make it any easier to accept. William nodded once, acknowledging her reaction without trying to correct it. I am not asking you to accept it. I am asking you to recognize that your memory of being left behind was never the full structure of what happened. Emma looked away for a moment, her eyes catching the distant glow of the hospital entrance again, where people came and went without knowing that a completely different conversation was unfolding just outside. Then show me something real, she said finally, turning back to him. Not explanations, not words, something that proves any of this actually happened the way you say it did. William studied her for a brief moment, as if weighing whether that request would move them forward or complicate everything further, and then he reached into his coat once more, pulling out a small encrypted device no larger than a key fob. He held it for a moment before speaking. This contains logs from that period. Not everything, but enough to show that what I told you was not created after the fact. Emma hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing against it cautiously, as if even physical proof now carried uncertainty. Why keep this? She asked quietly. William's gaze did not move away from her. Because at some point I believed I might need to explain it to you when it was no longer dangerous to do so. Emma studied the device, then looked back up at him, her voice lower now. And is it safe now? William paused, and that pause itself felt like an answer that was not fully reassuring. Safer than it was then. Not completely safe. Emma exhaled slowly, her thoughts no longer driven by anger but by something more disorienting, the sense that every layer she uncovered only revealed another beneath it. You keep saying I was protected, she said carefully, but protection without consent feels like another kind of absence. William's expression tightened slightly, not in disagreement, but in recognition of the truth behind her words. I understand why it feels that way. Emma looked at him more directly now, her voice steady but no longer defensive. Understanding it and living it are not the same thing. A faint silence followed, not empty but heavy with everything neither of them had said out loud until now. William nodded slightly, as if accepting that distance. No, they are not. Emma shifted her grip on the device, then looked back toward the hospital entrance again, her thoughts briefly drifting toward her son inside, the life she had built without answers, the years of assuming closure where there had only been silence. If I open this, she said slowly, there is no going back to not knowing. William answered without hesitation, though his voice softened. There was never a version of this where you did not end up here eventually. Only versions where you were less prepared for it. Emma turned back to him, and for the first time her expression was no longer purely conflicted, but quietly determined. Then maybe the question was never why you left. William watched her closely, not interrupting. Emma tightened her hold on the device slightly, her voice steady as she finished her thought. Maybe the real question is what you were trying to keep me from seeing until I was standing here anyway. The night around them felt still again, but not empty, as if something irreversible had finally been acknowledged without resolution, and in that space between truth and timing, Emma Carter understood that whatever came next would no longer be about whether she had been abandoned, but about what had been happening all along while she was never allowed to look directly at it. Emma Carter stood motionless with the encrypted device resting in her palm, its weight now feeling less like an object and more like a threshold she had not fully decided to cross, while William Hayes watched her in silence that no longer felt like distance but anticipation, as if he already knew the moment she pressed play would change everything that remained between them. Emma finally exhaled, her voice low but steady. If I open this, there is no version of my life where I can go back to not knowing. William did not move, but his answer came immediately, controlled yet quieter than before. There never was. That simple statement settled over her like a final step she had already been walking toward without realizing it, and slowly she lifted the device, her thumb hovering for a moment before she activated it. At first there was only static, then a faint recording interface appeared, followed by timestamps that matched the night she had been forced to reconstruct in fragments for years. Emma's breath slowed as she listened, her eyes fixed on the subtle glow of the screen, while William remained still beside her, no longer interrupting, no longer explaining. The first audio fragment was brief, voices overlapping in controlled urgency, mentions of secured transfers, redirected attention, and protective extraction protocols, none of which made immediate emotional sense, but all of which carried an underlying structure that suggested coordination rather than abandonment. Emma's grip tightened slightly as she listened, her mind struggling to align what she was hearing with the version of absence she had lived through. Then came another segment, clearer, marked by William's voice issuing instructions she had never heard before, not cold, not detached, but focused in a way she had never associated with her memory of him leaving. Emma looked up briefly toward him, but he did not meet her eyes, instead keeping his attention fixed somewhere beyond the present moment, as if listening to his own past being played back was not easier for him than it was for her. The recording shifted again, and this time Emma heard references to relocation, security diversion, and ensuring that no identifiable link remained between certain individuals and the event she had always called the night he disappeared. Her heart tightened not from fear, but from the growing contradiction forming inside her understanding. You erased yourself from every trace, she said quietly without looking away from the screen. William answered softly. I removed the connection, not the existence. The distinction should have felt like semantics, but instead it felt like a fracture in the foundation of everything she had believed. Another fragment played, this time slower, more fragmented, including a line that referenced ensuring she was not contacted under any circumstances, followed by a pause that felt longer than the rest of the recording combined. Emma felt her throat tighten slightly, not in pain, but in recognition of intention that did not align with abandonment, but with deliberate distance. She lowered the device slightly, her voice quieter now. You chose silence over explanation. William finally turned his gaze toward her, and in his expression there was no avoidance left, only clarity shaped by years of holding something that could not be shared. I chose your distance from it over your exposure to it. Emma studied him for a long moment, and for the first time, she saw no contradiction in his restraint, only consequence that had extended far beyond that single night. The final portion of the recording played automatically, shorter than the others, ending with a confirmation that all external ties had been successfully severed, followed by a quiet acknowledgement that the objective had been achieved. The screen dimmed slowly after that, leaving only reflection and silence between them. Emma stood there, no longer questioning whether the story was real, but what it meant that her life had been shaped by a protection she never consented to and a disappearance she had misread for years. She looked at William again, her voice no longer sharp, but deeply uncertain. So everything I believed about being left behind was never the truth. William did not deny it, nor did he try to soften it. Instead he spoke with a quiet finality that carried no defense, only acceptance. You were never left. You were kept away. Emma absorbed the words slowly, not as comfort, not as resolution, but as something that redefined the shape of her past without yet giving her permission to feel anything clear about it. In that moment, standing in the space between what she had lived and what she had just heard, Emma Carter understood that closure was no longer about answers, but about learning how to live inside a truth that had always existed beside her, just outside the reach of everything she thought she knew. Emma Carter remained standing in the same spot even after the recording ended, as if any movement would break the fragile balance between the past she had lived and the truths she had just been shown, while the quiet glow of the device faded in her hand and left only the weight of understanding she had not yet fully accepted. The parking garage felt colder now, not because the temperature had changed, but because everything familiar about her memory no longer felt stable. William Hayes watched her carefully, not interrupting, not pressing, only waiting, as if this moment was not something to control but something to endure. Emma finally spoke, her voice quieter than before, almost uncertain. So I was never abandoned, William answered, without hesitation. No. The simplicity of it should have brought relief, but instead it created more distance between what she had felt for years and what she now knew to be structured silence. Emma looked down at the device again, then slowly closed her hand around it, as if holding it tighter might help her stabilize her thoughts. Then what do I do with everything I lived through? She asked, her voice barely steady. If the reason I suffered is not what I believed it was. William's expression softened slightly, not in comfort, but in recognition of the weight of that question. You do not replace it. You understand it differently. Emma let out a slow breath, her gaze drifting toward the hospital entrance again where life continued unaffected by the conversation happening outside, and for the first time she felt something unfamiliar forming beneath the confusion, not forgiveness, not anger, but disorientation without a clear place to put it. You made decisions that removed me from the truth for my own safety, she said carefully, almost testing the sentence as she spoke it. William nodded once. Yes. Emma turned back toward him, her voice quieter but more direct now. And you never considered that removing the truth might also remove my ability to understand my own life? That question lingered longer than any of the others, and for the first time William did not respond immediately, because the answer was not simple, nor clean, nor something that could be justified without consequence. When he finally spoke, his tone was lower, more reflective. I considered it. I chose what I believed was the least harmful outcome at the time. Emma studied him closely, not looking for contradiction anymore, but for clarity in the space between intention and result. And now, she said slowly, you think I am ready for it? William met her gaze directly. I think you are already inside it, whether you are ready or not. A long silence followed, not empty but full of unresolved alignment between two versions of reality that no longer matched but could no longer be separated. Emma lowered her eyes briefly, then looked back at him, her voice steadier now, though still carrying uncertainty. "I do not know what changes after this," William answered quietly. "Nothing external changes. Only your understanding of what has always been there." Emma shifted her weight slightly, the device still in her hand now feeling less like evidence and more like responsibility, and she finally asked the question that had been forming beneath all others. "Was there ever a version of my life where I would not end up standing here hearing this?" William paused, and for the first time his answer carried no structure of explanation, only honesty. "No. Only versions where you would have arrived here without knowing why." Emma absorbed that slowly, not as comfort, but as realization that her life had always been moving toward a moment she was never allowed to see coming, and now standing in the quiet of the parking garage with the hospital lights behind her, she understood that the truth was not something she had discovered, but something she had finally reached after years of being guided around it without ever knowing it was there. Emma Carter stood in silence that no longer felt like confusion alone, but like the beginning of acceptance that came without permission, while the faint glow of the hospital entrance behind her marked a world that continued to move forward regardless of how completely her understanding of the past had just shifted. The device in her hand felt less important now, not because it had lost meaning, but because it had already fulfilled its purpose of breaking open a version of reality she had carried for years without question. William Hayes remained where he was, watching her with an expression that was no longer guarded in the same way, as if something between explanation and consequence had finally settled into place. Emma finally spoke, her voice low and steady. "If I had known any of this earlier, I do not know what I would have done differently." William responded after a brief pause, his tone calm but direct. "You would not have been able to do anything differently. That is the point." Emma looked up at him, studying him now without anger, but with a quieter form of uncertainty. "So my entire experience was shaped by decisions I was never aware of?" William nodded once. "Yes. And that is why it felt like absence instead of protection." The word protection no longer sounded abstract to her, but heavy, complicated, and incomplete. Emma shifted her gaze toward the ground for a moment, then back toward him, her voice softer. "You keep speaking as if everything you did was final, like there was no alternative path." William's expression tightened slightly, not defensively, but with the weight of something long carried. "There were alternatives. None of them ended without risk to you." Emma absorbed that slowly, not rejecting it immediately, but not accepting it either, because the idea that her life had been influenced by decisions made in parallel to her awareness created a disorientation she was still trying to organize into understanding. A faint sound from the hospital doors opening again reminded them both that time was still moving forward outside of their conversation, and Emma realized how long they had been standing in this suspended moment between past and present. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, not as confrontation, but as uncertainty about direction. William did not answer immediately, and when he did, his voice carried something more measured than before. "Now you decide what part of the truth you want to live with." Emma frowned slightly. "That sounds like a choice I was never prepared to make." William acknowledged that without hesitation. "You were not prepared. That does not mean you are not capable of it now." Emma looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time, her perception of him was no longer anchored in either absence or explanation, but in something more complex, a person shaped by decisions she had never seen, carrying consequences she had lived through without understanding their structure. She slowly lowered the device in her hand, no longer gripping it tightly, and asked the question that now mattered more than explanation. "If I walk away from this, does my life return to what it was before?" William's answer was immediate but quiet. "No. Because what you know now cannot be unknowable again." Emma nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in recognition of that truth. The space between them felt different now, not resolved, but clarified in a way that removed illusion without replacing it with certainty. Emma finally spoke again, her voice steady but softer than before. "Then I need time to understand what I am standing in." William stepped back slightly, giving space without distance, and said simply, "Take it." Emma looked once more toward the hospital entrance, where her life outside this moment still waited, then back at him, and for the first time since seeing him again, she did not feel pulled entirely by anger or confusion, but by the quiet realization that the past she had believed was finished had only been waiting for her to finally see it from the inside. Emma Carter remained still for a long moment after William Hayes finished speaking, not because she had nothing to say, but because every possible response now felt too small to hold the weight of everything she had learned in such a short span of time, and the parking garage around them seemed quieter than before, as if even the space itself was adjusting to a different version of reality. The hospital entrance behind her continued to open and close with soft mechanical rhythm, people moving in and out of light and shadow without awareness of the conversation that had just rewritten the meaning of years in her life. Emma finally exhaled, her voice calm but distant. "I need to go see my son." William nodded immediately, as if he had expected that answer. "That is why I stayed here instead of letting this end somewhere else." Emma looked at him briefly, not reacting outwardly, but registering the weight of that statement in a way she could not yet define, and then she slowly turned toward the hospital doors. William did not stop her, but his voice followed after a brief pause. "Emma." She stopped but did not turn fully. "You do not have to decide anything about us tonight." Emma stood there for a moment, the word us lingering in her mind in a way she was not prepared to unpack, and then she gave a slight nod without turning back fully, continuing forward into the hospital. Inside, the warmth of the building contrasted sharply with the cold stillness she had just left behind, and she moved through the hallway with a sense of displacement, as if the environment she had known for years was unchanged while she herself had shifted into something unfamiliar. The fluorescent lights reflected softly off the polished floor as she made her way toward the pediatric wing where her son was staying, each step feeling more grounded than the last, yet still accompanied by the lingering echo of everything William had revealed. When she reached the room, she paused briefly outside the door, taking a steadying breath before entering. Her son was resting quietly, his breathing even, his small form relaxed under the soft hospital blankets, and for a moment everything outside that room faded into the background. Emma approached slowly, sitting beside the bed and gently adjusting the blanket near his shoulder, her fingers moving carefully as if afraid that too much force might disturb the fragile calm of the moment. She watched him for a long time without speaking, the contrast between this immediate reality and the expanded truths she had just encountered creating a silence inside her that was different from confusion, something closer to recalibration. The events of the night replayed in fragments, not as emotions now, but as structured pieces trying to align into a shape she could understand. William's voice, the recordings, the explanations, the years she had lived believing she had been abandoned. She lowered her gaze slightly, her hand resting still near her son's, and for the first time she allowed herself to consider that everything she had felt before had been real, even if the reasons behind it were not what she had believed. The distinction did not erase her pain, but it changed its origin, and that change carried a complexity she was still learning how to hold. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and a nurse entered quietly to check on the monitors, offering a brief professional update before leaving again, returning the room to silence. Emma remained seated, her eyes fixed gently on her son, and slowly she realized that while the world outside had shifted in meaning, this moment remained unchanged, steady, grounding, and real. Yet beneath that steadiness, William's words still lingered, not as interruption, but as continuation, suggesting that the life she had built was not being rewritten, but finally revealed in its full structure. Emma exhaled slowly, her voice barely above a whisper even though no one was listening. So nothing was ever simple. The words did not ask for an answer. They only acknowledged the shape of what she now knew. Outside the room, the hospital continued its quiet rhythm of movement and light, while inside, Emma Carter sat between what she had always believed and what she was only beginning to understand, no longer standing at the end of a story, but at the edge of everything that had been unfolding long before she realized there was more to see. Emma Carter remained seated beside her son's hospital bed long after the room had settled into its steady rhythm again, the soft hum of medical equipment blending into a kind of silence that felt different from everything she had experienced outside in the parking garage, because here the world still made sense in its simplest form: breath, rest, presence. She watched her son for a long time, his face calm in sleep, and for the first time that night her thoughts were not racing forward or backward, but settling into something quieter, something closer to understanding without urgency. Yet even in the stillness, William Hayes's words continued to echo in her mind, not as fragments anymore, but as structured meanings she could no longer ignore. The idea that nothing in her life had been as random as she once believed did not bring comfort, but it also did not feel like betrayal anymore, only complexity. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and a nurse entered briefly to adjust the monitors before quietly stepping out again, leaving Emma alone once more with her son and her thoughts. She lowered her gaze slightly, her hand resting near his, and whispered almost without realizing it, "You were there all along, even when I thought you were gone." The words did not carry accusation, only realization, and she felt the weight of them shift something inside her understanding of the past. Minutes passed, or perhaps longer, as she remained in that position, until the quiet sound of her phone vibrating in her pocket pulled her attention back to the present. She hesitated before answering, and when she looked at the screen, William Hayes's name appeared. For a moment she considered ignoring it, but instead she stepped slightly away from the bed and answered in a low voice, "I am here." There was a brief pause on the other end before William spoke, his tone steady but softer than before. "I am outside. I did not want to leave without knowing your son is stable." Emma looked toward the hospital door instinctively, even though he could not see her, and for a moment she said nothing. Then she replied, "He is sleeping." Another pause followed, not uncomfortable, but measured, as if both of them were carefully stepping around the weight of everything that had already been said. William finally spoke again. "Then I will leave if you want me to." Emma closed her eyes briefly, not because she was unsure, but because the simplicity of that offer felt different from everything else about him, and when she answered, her voice carried a quiet steadiness she had not felt earlier. "You do not have to leave just because I am still processing this." There was a subtle shift in his tone when he responded, "I am not trying to stay in your life. I am only making sure you are not alone in what you are seeing now." Emma turned slightly toward the window of the hospital room, where faint city lights blurred against the night outside, and for the first time she realized that her understanding of him had also changed, not into trust, but into something more cautious, something that no longer fit into simple categories of right or wrong. "Everything I believed about that night is gone," she said quietly. William answered after a moment, "What is gone is the illusion. What remains is what actually happened." Emma absorbed that slowly, letting the words settle without resisting them, and when she finally spoke again, her voice was calmer. "I do not know what I am supposed to do with what remains." William's reply came gently, without pressure. "You do not have to do anything with it tonight." A long silence followed, and in that silence Emma looked back at her son, sleeping peacefully, untouched by the complexity surrounding his mother's past. The contrast grounded her in a way nothing else had that night, and she realized that no matter how much the truth had expanded, her present remained here, in this room, in this moment. Finally, she spoke one last time into the phone, her voice steady but quieter than before. "Do not disappear again without telling me." There was no hesitation in William's answer, only calm certainty. "I will not." The line went silent, not as an ending, but as a pause between two versions of a story that had finally begun to align with reality instead of memory, and Emma Carter remained by her son's side, no longer trapped in the belief that she had been abandoned, but standing at the edge of a truth that was still unfolding, slowly, inevitably, and no longer hidden from her. Emma Carter remained in the hospital room long after the call had ended, sitting beside her son as the steady rhythm of his breathing became the only constant in a night that had otherwise rewritten everything she thought she understood about her life, and for the first time since stepping into this truth, she did not feel like she was falling through uncertainty, but instead standing at the beginning of something she had not yet learned how to name. The fluorescent light above cast a soft, neutral glow over the room, and the city beyond the window continued its distant movement, indifferent to the emotional weight that had unfolded within these walls. Emma gently adjusted the blanket near her son's shoulder, her fingers slow and careful, as if grounding herself through touch rather than thought, and she realized that the silence inside her was no longer filled with anger or confusion, but with something closer to reluctant clarity. William Hayes's words still echoed in her mind, not as interruption, but as structure, forming a narrative that did not erase her past but redefined its boundaries. The idea that she had not been abandoned, but instead deliberately distanced from a situation she was never meant to see fully, no longer felt like a justification, but like a truth that carried consequences she had yet to fully process. A soft knock at the hospital door broke the stillness, and a nurse entered briefly, offering a quiet check of the monitors before leaving again without disturbance, restoring the calm of the room. Emma did not move, her attention fixed on her son, but her awareness shifted inward, no longer chasing explanations, but observing how those explanations had already begun to reshape her memory of the past. Her phone vibrated again softly on the table beside her, and she hesitated before looking at it. William Hayes's name appeared once more. She answered without stepping away this time, her voice steady. "I am still here." There was a brief pause before he responded, his tone calm but measured. "I am downstairs. I will leave if you prefer distance." Emma looked toward the window, then back at her son, and for a moment she considered the weight of that choice not as emotional reaction, but as consequence. "You do not need to leave because I am still trying to understand," she said finally. William did not respond immediately, and when he did, his voice carried no pressure, only presence. "Then I will remain nearby, without interrupting your space." Emma absorbed that quietly, recognizing for the first time that his approach was not about control, but about restraint shaped by something she still did not fully understand. She lowered her gaze slightly, her voice softer now. "Everything I believed about my life before this night feels incomplete now," William answered gently. "Incomplete is closer to truth than what you had before." The simplicity of that statement stayed with her longer than any explanation he had given earlier, because it did not attempt to resolve her confusion, only to redefine it. Emma remained silent for a few moments, then spoke again, not as question, but as acknowledgement. "I think I need time before I can decide what any of this means for me." William's response was immediate but calm. "Take all the time you need." The line remained open for a moment longer, either of them speaking, and in that silence there was no longer confrontation or explanation, only distance that had begun to shift into understanding. Emma eventually ended the call and placed the phone back on the table, her attention returning fully to her son, who continued to sleep peacefully, untouched by the complexity that now surrounded his mother's past. She sat there quietly, her hand resting near his, and for the first time since the night began, she was not searching for answers or trying to resolve contradictions, but simply allowing the truth to exist without forcing it into meaning. Outside the hospital room, the city continued its movement, lights passing in the distance like fragments of lives unfolding independently of her own, and inside, Emma Carter realized that she was no longer standing at the edge of a story she thought had ended, but within one that had always been continuing beneath the surface, waiting for her to finally see it clearly enough to decide what kind of future she was willing to build from it.